I'm joined by Congressman Will Hurd, who represents the 23rd District of Texas. He's a former CIA operative and a former cybersecurity professional. And to his left, we've got Michelle Richardson, who's with the Center for Democracy and Technology. She formerly was doing legislative issues at the ACLU and is an expert in civil liberties and privacy. Next, we've got Chris Furlow, who's at Ridge Global, which is a risk management firm, and Chris is a vaunted expert in risk management techniques and practices. And finally, we've got Marcy Wheeler, who's an expert national security journalist and knows about all things government surveillance and privacy. So let's just jump right in. Congressman, based on your professional cybersecurity background, just tell us a little bit about how you think this administration is doing on cybersecurity issues thus far, 9 months in. And if anyone else wants to jump in after that, feel free.
Well, I think cybersecurity is probably one of the few remaining bipartisan issues in Capitol Hill, and that's something that I've enjoyed working on. I think one of the difficulties that we're looking at now with the number of acting chief information officers, the CIOs, through the agencies, I'm worried that we don't want to stall some of the progress that we've achieved over the last couple of years. But there's recent legislation that I was involved in. It's called the Modernizing Government Technology Act, which empowers CIOs to introduce the latest and greatest technology into their digital infrastructure, which is important. But we're trying to change the tools that the federal CIOs have in order to protect the .gov space. And this is something that this administration has made a priority. They've let the agency heads recognize and understand that cybersecurity is one of their functions, and that they're going to be ultimately held responsible for cybersecurity. We still have agencies where the federal CIO doesn't report directly to the agency head or the deputy agency head, which would never happen in private sector. But the broader conversation on what is a digital act of war and what should our response be, those conversations, and again, this is not just being critical of this current administration. We had the same issues under the last administration. If we all know that if North Korea had launched a missile into Equifax headquarters, we all know how we would what the response would be.
We'd cheer.
And by the way, I do not condone violence against any commercial building. All right. We know how we would respond. So why do we not have some of those same rules of engagement when it comes to the digital space? And a response to a digital attack may not always be a digital response. Look to the UN on what they define as a act of war. Messing with someone's utility grid is considered an act of war, but when the Russians did it against the Ukrainians, what was the response? Nothing. There's still so many countries that don't have criminal laws when it comes to hacking, and that's why I think the elimination of Chris Painter's position at the State Department was a bad move, because we still need to be working with many of our allies to tighten up criminal laws so that we have an international framework to push some of these issues. So there's still a lot of questions that we need to answer, but again, because this is a bipartisan issue, I think we can keep pushing and getting to those answers.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I would just like to say, this morning the conversation is centered quite a bit around policy that happens here in Washington, D.C. And we're talking about global paradigms and the like. We can't lose sight when we're talking about regulation, when we're talking about legislation and the like, without thinking about those small and medium-sized businesses. I think oftentimes when we think about the private sector as it relates to cybersecurity, we forget they are a really important element in all this. Intelligence community aside, all of those things are very important. But if you look at who's being targeted quite often frequently, it's small and medium-sized businesses. They have to be a part of that conversation. So as we look at what the administration is doing relative to the EO, for example, and they're looking for inputs coming in through that process, we have to make sure that we don't take that element off the table. Because if you think about the big companies in this country, right, you've got small and medium-sized businesses in their supply chain. They can potentially be a backdoor, so we need to include them in this national conversation that's ongoing.
Marcy, how well is that process happening of including smaller and medium-sized businesses in this conversation?
I live in Michigan, which is one of the kind of front lines of IoT because people are putting stuff in cars that has no business to be in cars. But you know, I've been in Silicon Valley talking about cybersecurity with people in Silicon Valley, and they're like, why can't the car companies deal with X, Y, and Z? And I'm like, they're dealing with the same problem Google can't fix with updating phones. If Google cannot update Android phones, we shouldn't expect Chrysler to be able to update Android, you know, update their Jeeps. And I think that is, I mean, it is absolutely true that most people who are in this conversation have no idea what the development cycle in the automotive industry is, and have no idea, you know, you're talking 5 years of exposure to some provider who has no margins.
And automakers have a long track
software,
record
right? Yeah.
of you know, working in safety, and they have their minds attuned to it. I've just recently started installing some smart devices in my house, and so this is very top of mind for me. What worries me?
Packages at your door, right?
Right. What worries me is, you know, what happens when a company whose, you know, experiences in making dishwashers or making toasters, they don't have the background in privacy by design or security by design to handle the threats that might arise. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and this is somewhere that the administration can go forward, and in a way that actually protects civil liberties and advances cybersecurity at the same time. And Mr. Joyce has talked about the Internet of Things and the concern there. And almost everything's connected. It's collecting the type of data that's just never existed or been available before. And it's not protected by privacy law, right? It doesn't shoehorn into something that exists. So we need to have a very thorough conversation about all the people who are going to have access to this. And that means the companies, maybe hackers, right, and the government, and what are the rules around that. And that's a way that we can move both the civil liberties and the cybersecurity forward at the same time.
When I leave here today, I'm going to do a hearing on the cybersecurity around the Internet of Things. And many of the questions is, you know, look, yes, let's not make the same mistakes when we talk about the Internet of Things that we made with the Internet. And we should be, you know, having security be at the beginning, not an afterthought. But one of the questions when you legislate, can you legislate for outcomes? Can you, because if we legislated we should do X, Y, and Z, that's not going to evolve over time. It's going to get, by the time we actually pass the legislation, is it already old news? And, you know, an example I would say is political advertising. Right? When the federal election law was written, we were thinking about broadcast and news and radio, but we weren't talking about social media. And so that's an example of how you have legislation that doesn't evolve over time with things that we can't even think about right now. And yes, you know, a lot of the data that's being collected, people haven't been able to opt into it. You know, who opted into Equifax? Nobody. And so these are, and now that has changed how you do authentication. And I think what I find interesting is that the Equifax breach has probably not reached, in my opinion, kind of the anger that we saw with OPM. And part of it is because we're not going to see the impacts for months, if not years. Mm-hmm. And it really has changed the way we can, that, you know, major banks or things are able to do authentication. So these are, if we want to legislate, how do you make it to where it evolves in a everly evolving, you know, industry?
So I wanted to come back to this issue of legislation and making the case for legislation, because it often seems like in these types of situations you have industries who argue, well, look, you know, this is a newly evolving industry. You know, don't rush to regulate. I think you know, one of our earlier panelists said, don't. You know, I think it was Rob Joyce who said, don't rush to balkanize the regulation. How do you change the conversation around that so that you know, legislation becomes possible?
Well, it starts with raising the common body of knowledge on these topics. And it's hard. It starts with educating staff. You got to have members that are dealing with these issues that understand it. So many times, many of my colleagues think that the dark web is the direct messaging function of Twitter, right? That is not the dark web. Or that the cloud is emerging technology. The cloud has emerged. That is some of the difficulties that we're having to deal with. But the same principles and theories that we've always been dealing with apply now. When we talk about encryption, I'm on the side where you strengthen encryption, not weakening it, right? Encryption is good for our national security. Encryption is good for our economy. We should be making it stronger. And we've had these debates when locks came out or the latest safe came out, right? So we've had these conversations already. We just have to figure out how do we apply the principles that we all hold so dear to the latest technology, and that means you have to understand it. Oh, and by the way, this is all going to change when quantum computing becomes a thing. Quantum computing is here sooner. It's going to be here sooner rather than later, and to me, that is going to what is the issue of who masters quantum computing is going to be the hegemon in the world, because how we do encryption and think about protection will be null and void.
I want to jump in and just say, I think you're right, Congressman Hurd, but one of the things I find in talking to people on the Hill, and I'm sure, Michelle, you have the same experiences, is there really aren't the staffers. I mean, certainly members of Congress who tend to be old don't have the technical experience. You're one of the few people, there are probably 8 that I can go to who I can trust to know something about technology, and the staffers aren't there either. And so on the Hill, we really have a dearth of knowledge about technology, the impact of it, the risks of it, and that's something I think we need to do better at, especially on the intelligence community.
And that's what's happening at the policy maker level, right? So within companies as well, you also have catch-up that needs to be done. So if you think about it, most of the folks who are in leadership positions in corporate entities today or businesses today, or they're on the boards, for example, they weren't taught this type of risk management when they were in business school. They were taught financial risk management. This is a real challenge. We've got to bring people up to speed. So we can talk about the quantum computing, those things, but right now that's over some folks' heads. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying you can't remove the accountability at the corporate level for what goes on in the cyber environment of a company. You can't do that. But let's be realistic about the education process that needs to take place and try and pull public and private resources together in order to address that issue so that from a governance standpoint, we can begin to make progress, because what's happened so far is that the technology has outpaced our ability to define a very good governance system, both at the corporate level and frankly at the policy level.
Well, and Brian, I think one way forward is to focus on what the government purchases itself, which is why I'm excited about Mr. Hurd's bill or the American Technology Council out of the White House, and this idea that if we're going to be updating our systems and software, we make sure there are cybersecurity standards in it, right? There's privacy by design, we would argue, and these are things that will stand the test of time. And the government is at its zenith, right, when it's purchasing its own products. And hopefully it will lift all boats, though, over time, right, as some of these things are built into widely used products. And that would be a way to cabin the issue, right, and do something more specific than trying to address the entire technology sector at one time.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about some fairly high level, maybe mid-level concepts here, okay? But there's some basic stuff that we're still getting wrong. Patch your software, okay? This is not, none of the hacks that we're talking about are zero-day exploits. Zero-day is a previously unknown vulnerability that's been taken advantage of. That's not what's happening. It is people not patching their software, misconfiguring your systems, not doing basic stuff like having two-factor authentication, your network administrator, using the word password as a password. It's like,
folks
really,
being careless.
Who is still doing that? And so it's basic digital hygiene. And so how we can improve this in the government? Oversight of Congress. And that's why we do a thing called it's a FATARA scorecard, but we're turning it into a digital hygiene scorecard. So we're looking at how many people are consolidating data centers. Every time we do a review, some other agency finds out, oh, we had more data centers than we expected. You were supposed to do a review of this 5 years ago. How are you still now finding that you have extra data centers that you never knew about, right? Or licensing of software. If we were to, we're introducing this into our scorecard. If we would have graded everybody last January, everyone would have gotten an F. They still don't know what software they're using on their systems, right? Like it's unimaginable if that were to happen in private sector. We can't let it continue, and that's why it's important for Congress to continue to shine a light on some of these problems. Like, I realize some of my hearings are really boring because I bring them over and it's like, why are you doing this? And they're like, oh, Congressman, we fixed it yesterday. Okay, great, you know? But at least it's getting done. And so we have to continue to have that shine a light, and it's great to have other outside organizations that are looking at these issues and helping to guide and talk about some of the problems we should be looking at.
At this point, does the general public face more of a risk on cyber or privacy from the public sector or from the private sector?
Yes. No, both. I mean, the lesson of OPM and Equihacks is that you can't trust either the government or the private sector with your data, right? And there are, I mean, I think there are some tech companies that I might trust with my data, except they're using it to advertise to me or selling ads to the Russians. So I think that one of the things that happened while we've been sitting here is that Europe ruled in favor of Max Schrems again. For those who know, he's an activist. And so Europe continues to say, you need to be able to tell consumers what you're doing with their data. And in Europe, they laugh at us for how freely we as Americans give our data over. Europe tends to add pressure to the Facebooks and Googles of the world, and we either need to start doing that in the United States as well, or we need to really leverage what Europe forces our tech companies to do and our government to do. But
let's not use Germany as any example, because the German government owns 1/3 of the telecommunications infrastructure in that country. The BND, their intelligence service, can do things against German citizens in Germany that the NSA would never even think about. And so I get frustrated with some of our European allies that want to act like privacy is not a concern in the United States. That's completely untrue, and it's disingenuous for the Germans to act like they're holier than thou when they recently the BND was targeting a German reporter in Germany. Like that kind of stuff is unacceptable, and so privacy is important. Our civil liberties are important, but saying that Europe has a higher standard than we do is completely erroneous.
Yeah, this conversation is taking place on so many different levels, and obviously that's what makes it complex. So you have the security issues and the privacy issues just on their face value that you're dealing with. Then there's the intelligence and the military that are in the national security interests or the economic interests of a nation. And then beyond that, you get into the political, right? So you've got all these different layers, and it really makes it complex. So for example, many of you are familiar with GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that will be coming out in 2018 across the EU. Well, on its face, obviously, it's about protecting the privacy of European citizens and that right to be left alone. That's important and laudable. But by the same token, is it perhaps a backdoor trade sanction against companies from other nations outside the EU?
Yes.
If they don't follow the compliance, again, there's enough wiggle room in GDPR to where that potentially could happen. So again, some of these conversations, there are multi levels to that to the discussion, and we have to take all of that in and understand that.
Michelle, you've dealt with a lot of policymaking on privacy. What's your take on what's happening in Europe, and how much of that could migrate to the United States?
Well, we often hear here in the United States that a lot of the functionality and control and granularity we would like to see in our products is just not possible. But what Europe shows us often is that it is, right? And it's really a choice. And we do hope that some of the options that are over there will migrate here. This is hard because there is no international privacy agreement. There are little pieces in treaties about privacy or expression, but they haven't been explored fully. You've gotten the first decisions just in the last 5 years, 10 years, and we don't know where it's going to go. But hopefully over time, this is going to be a very, very long-term project, there will be something more international with a standard about privacy that we hope will lift all boats. It is hard though, because the Europeans almost see it the opposite that we do. They're more concerned about companies, where we're often more focused on what government does. So sometimes you feel like you're having an apples and oranges conversation about who's responsible, where the rules should fall, and what you should actually even be concerned about in the first place.
And one of the reasons I think that there is that disconnect is because we do something in the United States that many other countries don't. We have congressional oversight of our intelligence organizations. When I'm in Germany meeting with my Bundestag colleagues, they oftentimes ask us a question about intelligence cooperation between the US and Germany, because they know we know more than they do about what their own intelligence service is doing, because we're with the oversight we have of ours. And so that sheds a perspective, and I think some would say that they wish we had more perspective, but we have that oversight over our intelligence communities is something that we don't champion or laud or are proud of, because not many other, even many of our European allies don't have that opportunity. So we have an insight into the government activities that many of our allies don't. And I think that's why you see some of that focus. And I believe there's a tinge of protectionist in some of these activities that we see in Europe.
Harmonization of cyber norms is really going to be critical moving forward, but it is exceptionally difficult for the reasons I'd mentioned earlier. But that's really the challenge, right? Because if you look at it, you've got GDPR, which is obviously emerging, about to go into effect in the EU. Singapore has its data protection regulation. You've got the Chinese that are moving towards a new standard that potentially could come out. And all these are, in some laws, it's very vague about what the standard might be. So getting towards something that is more harmonized is really going to be critical in the years ahead.
And there's some, I'm sorry to keep going in, but I think there are some positive examples. Estonia. Estonia has only 1.3 million people, which is basically the size of my hometown of San Antonio. but they basically provide all services digitally. There is a trust between the Estonians and their government, and the government has established that trust with them. And they've been involved in a thing called the Tallinn Manual. Tallinn is the capital of Estonia, about how NATO allies should be working when it comes to cybersecurity. So there are some pockets of examples of how this has worked, and one of the things I think we're all harping on is the lack of trust. Lack of trust in the businesses to protect your information, lack of trust in the government to protect it or to provide oversight, and that is something that undergirds all these problems. And
I would say that as we move forward, whatever the legislation, so 702 is up for reauthorization this year. The government was permitted to share 12333 data, which is data collected overseas, raw data with other intelligence agencies this year. There's CISA, which was passed in 2015. On all of those, there should be a default for oversight, both congressional, but more importantly for statutorily independent oversight. So 12333 does not require the inspector generals of these agencies to be involved in the sharing and use of raw data collected overseas. That's a problem, because over and over again, we've seen at NSA, things don't get fixed until the inspector general comes in and actually looks at it. It's not enough for Congress. So those are, I think, ways to build trust. And the intelligence community sort of doesn't want to do that and didn't do it with 12333 and doesn't necessarily even have that with 702, which has a ton of oversight on it. And that's, I think, a way that you can build trust in the government that isn't there now. I mean, like PCLOB got thrown out of CISA at the last minute. No reason for that.
Yeah. Let me jump in here with a question from Twitter. Someone is asking, is blockchain a solution for information assurance? And I might expand that a little bit. What kind of technologies generally are emerging that could help us address the cybersecurity issue?
So blockchain, for those who aren't watching, is basically a distributed ledger, and you are able to keep track of every piece of information that changes along that chain. And the answer is yes. I think when you look at what Maersk is doing when it comes to their supply chain even Walmart is doing it within food safety, and Maersk is working with the Department of Homeland Security. So we're seeing the technology and how it can improve processes, reduce from point A to point B, but also provides a level of protection. And I think this is something that we should follow, and I believe the financial services industry, I think JP Morgan is one, JP Morgan is one that's really is kind of on the cutting edge of how you do this in private transactions. So it is absolutely, I think, something that to be
But did that help Maersk come back from not Petja?
No.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
Well, we
patch your software, have a password that's more than 14 characters, don't click on emails that you don't know the sender from, right?
Well, and supply chain. I mean,
things,
until you fix supply chain, which I think was that problem, and we've seen it again, that we, even in the United States, don't have visibility on what the supply chain is, and until you have that, you're not going to know whether Maersk is going to be shut down for shipping because of some Ukrainian software.
Look, technology is going to be really important. Blockchain is one of those technologies that could really be transformational, particularly in the financial services, insurance, and other industries. But we can't forget the people part of this equation, and I think sometimes when we're talking about cyber, we forget about that. The people and process part is really, in some cases, for example, allowing a hack because someone does click on the wrong email because they don't have enough training or awareness to know what they shouldn't do. Those types of issues inside companies and inside government agencies. Obviously, we have the same issues in government from a governance standpoint. Look at the SEC and the recent breach there and the notification process that took place. It mirrors some of the things we've seen on the private sector side. We've got enough work to go along here, but it has to be integrated. It has to have each of those elements. We have to be addressing the governance and organizational issues, the process piece, and the technology, leveraging that all in concert.
So let me just piggyback on that. I mean, a lot of what I write is sort of geared toward the average consumer, and often we go through these tips. Don't click on links from email senders you don't or anything like that. But it often seems like these rules tend to change with every hack. I mean, we just found out that SS7 vulnerabilities make two-factor authentication via text messages insecure. So how do we avoid a situation where consumers become disenfranchised with the state of security and throw up their hands and say, well,
the SS7 vulnerability is if you're using a 3G phone. Right. So again, I think
and the details associated with all of these little these revelations. Right. It's really hard for people to keep track of every twist and turn.
Well, and I would say we have to just accept that we already are disenfranchised with our devices, right? We are coming into a world where you're not going to have the option of buying a disconnected car or appliances, right? And the terms of service will say you have to share your information or this thing won't work. We'll brick it, right? We've now lost control over this data, and so at this point, it's not responsible to put the burden on the individual. For systemic change, it is going to have to come from the companies and the government. And I don't say that lightly. It really concerns me because there are serious surveillance or access to information issues involved, right, when the government or you're making some systematic changes. But I think that's just how we have to honestly deal with the problem. Individuals are never going to be able to control dozens of devices with different rules that were not even made to be durable in the long term, right? You paid $20 for this internet camera and you expect to have it for 6 months or a year. How much do you expect people to be invested in this thing?
One of the things that's come out in recent discussions about Russian tampering is you've got Facebook before Congress. You will have Twitter and Google before Congress. And there is a discussion about the responsibility of these companies if you want to fix the security of the average user, you fix it at Facebook, you fix it at Google, you fix it at Twitter. You start there. And we are having a discussion about the responsibility of Facebook for policing Russian advertisements on its site. But why can't that discussion be larger that says, why can't Twitter have a functional two-factor authentication, right? How can we make it harder for these tools that everybody uses and that really are the infrastructure of our digital world? That's where you need to fix it. And we're now having that discussion because of the Russian stuff. let's have the broader discussion about how to ensure that the security is there for the simple tools that everyone uses.
So we've come full circle on security and privacy by design, right? Because we have to start having that conversation at that level. Look, we're in there's a paradox that goes on here. You know, we want openness, we want access, we want convenience at the same time. We want security, we want safety, and we want privacy. We live in a world here where as our interconnectedness grows, the public and private sectors are more and more dependent and interdependent upon one another. So I think to Michelle's point, it's going to require to have business at the table and government at the table, but we haven't gotten to the point, I mean, we're talking big strategies, but we haven't gotten to the point where we're addressing each of these issues very systematically. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have as we all play catch up.
Yeah, and also I want, when I'm driving down Interstate 10 and there's not a stop, I want my Whataburger delivered to my car from a drone. Right?
That's right through the
sunroof. So you know, we should still embrace the opportunities we have, but we have to be able to continue to manage these.
Right, but I mean, the thing about going after Google and Facebook is their margins are huge. They're richer than God. And so if you can't get Google to be able to update an Android phone, you're never going to fix the problem because they have the margins to do it. Your drone manufacturer in Texas doesn't.
I mean, how much of this is just a failure to conceptualize the root causes of the problem, right? Like we talk about cybersecurity primarily as being a technical problem, but you know, what we see with disinformation or fake news or, you know, this type of thing is more of a sociological thing than a technical issue, right? I mean, how do we address that? How do we get Google and Facebook and Twitter to address that from a human perspective?
I mean, I think that some of them are trying. Some of them are not. And there needs to be, you know, one of the neatest changes in cybersecurity in recent years is that Consumer Reports has started focusing on it. And Teen Vogue has started focusing on it. If you can get Teen Vogue and Consumer Reports to start talking to your average soccer mom about what she needs to look for to keep her teenagers safe online, then you're going to have a much more responsible public than you are if it's, no offense to Congressman Hurd, sitting here in DC saying, you know, patch your software. Consumer Reports is a much more important, I think, voice in this than, no offense.
And that's why I mentioned earlier the importance of small business. I mean, let's face it, they're the backbone of the economy. We all hear that all the time. But these are folks that don't have a lot of resources. They're like the soccer mom, right? So education is a really important key to how we're going to make the societal change to where people understand, hey, everything about your life is on your devices, right? It's your tax information, you've got health information on there, you've got photos, all of that stuff that people really care about is on their devices. I think we just have, in our rearview mirror, we don't have enough time behind us for folks to have actually realized this. Now, the millennial generation, that's a totally different conversation. But we still have folks today that just haven't gotten to that point where they understand the risk that they have, whether it's the individual at home or in a small business.
And I think, I don't know how this is going to look, but at some point we would have to have accountability injected into the system. And if you look at other areas, they really made huge steps forward in their safety and usability because they were either sued or regulated, right? And I don't want to say that's a great approach, but those accountability mechanisms don't exist in tech. And so I don't know how long we can persist in that sort of framework if no one's going to be forced to change the products or offer something different.
So in the last panel, Richard Clark proposed the idea of penalizing companies that suffer from data breaches with monetary penalties, kind of like how we penalize oil spills. Congressman, is that something that you'd support?
Well, I would slightly disagree with the premise because I think it was this week's Fortune. There was a great article that looked at a study that was done by all the companies that had suffered some major breach. And there was a significant impact to their bottom line. And the reason that you're seeing the cybersecurity industry grow, right, and valuations of companies and all these purchases that are happening is because companies are recognizing that this is a gigantic impact to the bottom line. And I don't think that is something that is discussed as much, but there is an impact. And I do believe that FTC, when it comes to should be looking at issuing fines and some of the issues when some of these companies that do that, so that there really is a stick in this area. But there is an impact. And on your previous question, I'd like to just add, when I was in middle school and high school, I took a music class and a history class. I am now neither a musician or a historian, right? We should be educating some of our kids in more, how does the internet actually work, right? What does TCP/IP actually mean? Like, there should be a functional understanding, and it's not because they're gonna grow and become, computer scientists or cybersecurity professionals, but it's something that we need to understand so that we can be informed citizens.
Mm-hmm. Marcy, were you about to add something?
Oh, I want to just say on the liability issue, I think that the industry is better at assigning liability for financial data than they are at the stuff people really care about, which are the pictures I took at vacation, with my cousin. And so that needs to be part of the question, is the risks of the personal pictures are actually more important to your soccer mom than her financial data, because her bank is going to take care of that.
In terms of the regulatory piece, I think it's important. We need to flip the model a bit. So there's the regulatory approach, right? So it's the stick. On the carrot side, corporate leaders need to understand the enterprise value of the data that they possess, because then we can put it into business terms. If we start to do that, then we'll start to see that turn that we're all hoping to see in terms of an appreciation of the data, why it needs to be protected, why the resources need to be brought inside a company to protect it.
Michelle, anything to add?
No.
Well,
I think I put myself far enough out there for today.
Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you to our panelists.